In our last session, I argued that in chapter 7, Jesus stands on the side of the mountain and compels us to see with clarity, to see with wisdom. Again, this is a wisdom text. And as we dive into the next few verses, starting in chapter 7, verse 13, I think Jesus is going to compel us to see with clarity two choices or two options. There's going to be an option of what is on the surface appears to be a good option, but then as you look a little bit more carefully, with discernment, with wisdom, you see the truth that is under the surface. I think that's the connection that ties these next few sections together. The ability to see with discernment, to see what is on the surface, but more importantly, to see what is under the surface. So we start out with chapter 7, verse 13. Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way, the path is easy, but it leads to destruction." So notice again, on the surface, it's a wide gate, an easy path, but under the surface, it doesn't lead where you want to go. Then Jesus says, those who enter it are many. Verse 14, "For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard, that leads not to destruction, but to life. And those who find it are few." Well, of course, as Jesus teaches this wisdom statement, many are going, okay, sign me up for the narrow path. But Jesus is going, yeah, but it's narrow and it's hard. And it's not going to be popular. If I were to suggest to you that I'm just going to call it what I think it is, one of the false teachings that we buy into, especially in the Western church or the American church, is what I'm going to call a comfort gospel or a comfortable path. We maybe sometimes throw labels on things like the health and wealth gospel, different things like that. But I think this is perhaps even more subtle. And it's this good news that says, hey, follow Jesus because it's going to be better for you, good for you. It's going to be, and then we get more subtle under the surface. We're really saying it's going to be comfortable. It's going to make your life easy. And Jesus would say, better, yes, but how do we define better? Good, yes, but how do we define good? Easy? Not so much. So this path, another one of my favorite teachers has said, this path is narrow. We have to go one at a time. You can't go as a people group. You can't go as those who have a name, or even as a brand, as a church as a whole. You have to go one at a time. And the gate is ultimately just Jesus. It's narrow. There's no other way. John teaching would say, Jesus would say, I am the way, the truth, the life. There really is no other way. It's narrow. You have to go one at a time, one person deciding to follow Jesus at a time. But it's also hard. Jesus calls us to pick up his cross to follow him. He calls us to come and surrender ourselves, to sacrifice ourselves, to die. Even the image of baptism is an image of us dying to ourselves and saying we will live for him. This path, this vision that Jesus gives us from the side of this mountain is a choice. To say, will you follow me? It'll lead to life, but it's going to be hard. I think one of the things we need to be discerning about and wise about is casting this compelling vision forward, but being honest with the fact that following Jesus is not always popular. That following Jesus is sometimes a call to persecution, and always is a call to surrender and to die to self. So we notice this discernment that needs to take place between two options. What appears to be on the surface easy and wide, and yet leads to destruction. What appears on the surface to be hard and narrow, but leads to life. We come to this with wisdom, and we make a decision. We make a wise decision that's informed by Jesus' teaching and his life. Well, the second section, we could phrase it this way, is to have discernment in choosing our teachers or our guides. Verse 15, Jesus says, beware of false prophets. Now, notice again the surface appearance. Prophets, under the surface, false. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. They look on the surface one way, but under the surface they have a completely different motivation. Now, you know this. Jesus has been interplaying between the motivation of those who were Jewish teachers, especially the scribes and Pharisees in this context, and what they inwardly were in their heart. They were hungry, they were destructive. You will recognize them by their fruits. So we had sheep and wolves, And now we have trees. You're called to be discerning. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? No, you know this. But every healthy tree bears good fruit. It's the diseased trees that bear bad fruit. A healthy tree can't bear that bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit ultimately is cut down and thrown into the fire. Now, Jesus, again, highlights the fact that he is not only the merciful judge, but he will judge. And so we have this call for us to be able to look from the mountain and see. You will recognize them. You'll discern them by their fruits. Now we need to ask the question, what are the fruits? He then goes on, and I think this phrase ties much of what he's been doing with the wolves in sheep's clothing and the bad fruit and the good fruit, the diseased tree and the healthy tree together. Now he comes to a person, a case study. And he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. Now notice what's on the surface again. This cry out, Lord. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does. The one who does the work of my Father. Now, not the work of my Father, the will of my Father. The one who does the will of my Father. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy? Did we not do things in your name? Notice the tension here. Did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. By the way, many scholars point out this word know is an intimate word, sometimes used between the relationship between a husband and a wife. I never knew you. Now, notice again the appearance and under the surface. There are those who Jesus has already called hypocrites. They do one thing, but they are another thing. Jesus is pointing that same truth out here. There are those who can do things on the surface that really are for the applause of men, to impress other people, to make themselves build their own kingdom. But the reality is they don't know the heart of God. They're not doing these things with his heart and his heartbeat, for his motives, for his kingdom, for his desires. Remember our prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done, your desires be done. So they do these things, but they don't really do the will of the Father. There's this discernment that needs to take place, and I'm going to argue it needs to take place. We need to see ourselves with clarity first and foremost. Why do we do the things that we do? If we serve in a church, is it to be on a platform and to be noticed and to receive the applause of men? Or is it because we know God? And because we know him, we become like him. We live more like him. It's like a son looking up to a father and saying, I want to be like that. And we look to God and we take on his heart. He adopts us. We take on his heart and we take on his name, and we live that out in our relationships with one another. At the very end of this, Jesus says, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. And that's intriguing to us because of this do. They don't do the will of the Father, but there's these things that they do that look like they're works of the law. But Jesus goes, no, ultimately those things are lawless because you didn't have the heart that I'm calling you to. It is, again, this thread of a deeper or greater righteousness that Jesus has been teaching throughout this sermon, to see with wisdom and discernment ourselves as well as the hearts and lives of other people. Well, that should challenge us, and if it doesn't challenge us, maybe this next section will. He gives us, again, two choices. So what foundation will you build your life upon? It's this discernment of foundations. Chapter 7, verse 24. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, you see the connection, will be like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew against the house, and it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. And this is perhaps, again, one of Jesus' most famous parables, but we have this element of those who know the will of God and they build their lives upon it, this foundation that is there underneath of their lives. And yet on the surface, when it comes to the appearance, this house and the next house are going to appear the same. The main difference is what is underneath the surface. Now, we look at this and we see the rain and the storms that come and the waters that rise, and we go, okay, so is this the normal happenings that happen in life, difficulties and tragedies? And I would argue yes, and maybe still yet a bigger picture is the judgment that is to come. And I would argue it's both. That our life that's built on Jesus and on his kingdom, on his righteousness, on his foundation, is a house that will stand no matter what life brings our way in this world, but also ultimately is the only foundation that will stand. It's the narrow path. Well, he goes on and says this in verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine, notice there's a parallel. They hear the words, but they don't do them. They'll be like the foolish man who builds his house and now the foundation changes to be sand. Builds his house on the sand. The rains fell, the same kinds of things happened. The floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. And it's really with these words that Jesus ends this sermon. Now, I would argue that Matthew has somewhat summarized Jesus' sermon. It wasn't very long if he didn't. But Jesus seems to end his sermon right here. And it's with this kind of hanging question. What will your decision be? Where will you build your life? Do you really want to build it on something that's gonna fail? Do you want to walk down a path that leads to destruction, even though it's popular, even though it's easy, even though it's comfortable? Do you really want to follow someone who, when you look at them, what's really in their heart is diseased and ravenous and selfish? Jesus says, I challenge you to stand on this mountain, to see God more clearly, to see one another more clearly, and to make a discerning decision. And I would argue that the most discerning decision you could make is to look to Jesus and to say, I choose you. I choose you to be my king. I choose you to be my teacher. I choose you to be my example. I choose you to be my Lord. I choose you. I choose you for life. You see, that prayer is how we want to close out this series together. Your kingdom come, your will be done in me as well as in this world. Come, Lord Jesus.